So picture this. It's January 20th, 2026. You're in a room with the world's most powerful people in Davos, Switzerland. And the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gets up to speak. But what he says isn't just another boring political speech. No, it sets off a political earthquake that sends shockwaves all the way to the White House. And the reaction? It was absolutely electric. He got a standing ovation, which, is pretty rare at Davos. The Financial Times went even further, calling it maybe the best speech ever given there. So you have to ask, what on earth did he say that struck such a chord? Well, to really get it, we need to look at the world he was speaking to. Okay, so let's dig into the backstory here, because this wasn't some random speech. Oh no, this was a very deliberate move, made at a time when global tensions were already sky high. For the whole year leading up to this, the second Trump administration had really been turning up the heat. We're talking constant threats of tariffs, and even these off-the-cuff remarks about Canada becoming the 51st state. And just before Davos, Trump was in this big showdown with Denmark over Greenland, basically threatening any European allies that stood in his way. This was the political minefield that Mark Carney, who was just coming off a big election win, was about to step into. So what did he actually say? What were the words that caused all this drama? Well, it all came down to this one really powerful idea he called the rupture doctrine. He basically stood up there and said that the old, predictable, rules-based world order that everyone was so comfortable with was gone. And he didn't see it as some slow, gentle transition. He called it a rupture, a sudden, violent break. He described this new reality where the very tools of globalization, like trade and finance, were now being used as weapons by the world's biggest powers. And to really make his point hit home, he used this amazing analogy from the Czech writer Václav Havel. He said, think of a shopkeeper who puts a propaganda poster in his window. He doesn't believe a word of it, right? He just does it to keep the authorities happy to avoid trouble. Carney's point was that for years, countries like Canada had been doing the exact same thing, living within a lie, pretending the system was fair just to keep the peace. And his message was crystal clear. It's time to take the sign down. And this line just says it all. This was his call to arms. He argued that the smaller, middle-power countries had to stop competing with each other to get scraps of favor from the big guys. They needed to band together and create their own table. Because in this brutal new world, the rules are simple. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So you can probably guess how this went over. The speech landed like a bomb, and the world immediately split into two camps. On one side, people were cheering. On the other, well, they saw it as a direct threat. The praise just poured in. You had leaders from Finland, Australia, and Germany calling it stunning, courageous, and brilliant. The head of NATO famously declared, "Canada is back." It was like this collective sigh of relief, like Carney had finally said out loud what so many other leaders were thinking but were too afraid to say themselves. But then came the response from the White House. The very next day, President Trump got on that same stage, and he made it personal. He didn't just disagree. He essentially said Canada only exists because of America's generosity. And he ended with that incredibly direct, almost threatening line. Remember that, Mark. And believe me, this was not just talk. The consequences came fast. Trump immediately kicked Canada out of a new international group he was setting up, and then he dropped the hammer. A threat of a 100% tariff on literally every single thing Canada sells to the US. The diplomatic gloves were officially off. This massive backlash, of course, kicked off a whole new conversation. Was Mark Carney a bold visionary charting a new path for the world? Or was he a bit of a hypocrite, saying one thing in public while doing the complete opposite in private? And this is where things get a little messy. See, the whole point of Carney's speech was to call out big powers who use their economic might as a weapon. But his critics immediately jumped on the fact that just days before this speech, he'd signed a new strategic partnership with China and another one with Qatar. These are exactly the kind of powerful players his speech seemed to be aimed at. And as people started to look at the details of that China deal, it got even stranger. Apparently, part of the deal was partnering with Beijing's security ministry on fighting cybercrime. One Canadian think tank put it perfectly. They said it was ludicrous. It's like inviting a known serial arsonist to come help you with your fire prevention plan. And that in Canada, the opposition had a field day. They pointed out what they saw as this huge disconnect between Carney's soaring rhetoric on the world stage and the economic reality for everyday Canadians. The Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, was basically saying, you talk about building strength, but our deficit has doubled. You talk about feeding the country, but food prices are through the roof. You talk about being a stable partner, but our housing costs are the worst in the G7. The message was pretty simple. It's hard to be a global leader when your own house isn't in order. So when all the smoke cleared, what does this all mean? The speech, the applause, the backlash, it really forced a conversation about Canada's place in the world and what its future path should be. But here is the most fascinating part of this whole story. Despite all the criticism from politicians and experts, the Canadian public, they loved it. Polls showed this massive Davos bump. Mark Carney's personal approval rating shot up, way higher than his own party's. It seems for a lot of regular people, the message of Canada standing up for itself on the world stage was what really resonated, maybe even more than all the complicated policy details. Which leaves us with the million-dollar question. Was this speech really the beginning of a bold new foreign policy for Canada and other middle powers? Was it that moment of truth, of finally taking that sign out of the shock window? Or was it just a different kind of performance, a new sign for a new, more dangerous world? And honestly, that's a question we still don't have the answer to.